Hi, Brad. Let me first introduce you, and then we'll get right going. First of all, thanks for
Sure.
joining us. So,
Thank you for having me.
sure. To everyone who's joining us tonight, welcome back to Hillary PC's Thursday Night Candidate Forum. Tonight's guest is State Senator Brad Hoylman, a Democratic candidate for the Manhattan Borough President position. I met Brad 3 years ago when I learned that a proposed rezoning threatened the Merchants House Museum in downtown Manhattan, Manhattan's first landmark and one of the oldest residential landmarks in New York City. Brad stepped in, advocated in support of the Merchants House, and eventually, with his help and the help of other public officials, we won. About a month later, Brad stepped up again, this time to preserve two landmark properties in Greenwich Village at 827 and 831 Broadway, where a developer was trying to convert those buildings into a 30-story communications tower. Once again, with Brad's help, we were successful. Today, Brad is a Democratic candidate for Manhattan Borough President, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him dig into the issues tonight. It is my great pleasure to introduce Democratic Manhattan Borough President candidate, Brad Hoylman. How you doing, Brad?
Good to see you, Michael. Thanks for having me. It looks like you're reporting from the Merchant House, or you have a very historic living room.
Well, I'll tell you, I live in a house that's in an historic district, and I also live in a house which has been designated some sort of landmark status by the Architectural Trust in Washington, D.C. It's not because I have a really beautiful home. It's more like I have a really old house.
I love that.
But I do love the detail, and you have a sense
I love historic structures. It is, that kind of placemaking is so important to our city, but to the wider community and society. And it's such a shame when the pressures of economic development or frankly just ignorance get in the way of preservation. One of the things that first got me involved in local neighborhood activity and organizing, literally the first protest I ever attended in New York City was to object to NYU's proposed demolition of the Poe House. And I organized an event there, and then one on the Kimmel Center, because the new Kimmel Center was going to cast a shadow over Washington Square Park. So we had a bunch of umbrellas, and we stood out on Washington Square Park. Turns out we lost both of those fights, really. And it just shows you what we're up against when it comes to economic development, that want, essentially to tamp down, community support for historic structures.
The phones, unfortunately, that sometimes happens in today's day and age. The phone goes off. We're going to get into preservation in a few minutes, but I first wanted to direct attention to sort of the big ticket news item of the last couple of weeks, and that is the governor of the state of New York. Right now, Governor Cuomo is under investigation for sexual harassment, and at least in one instance, sexual assault of female members of his staff. In fact, one of those who have lodged a complaint against him is one of your opponents in the Manhattan Borough President race. Senator Hoylman, should Andrew Cuomo resign right now, or do you support the approach that's been taken by President Biden, which is to sort of wait and see how the investigation pans out?
Well, I called for his resignation shortly after the most recent round of complaints were made public. I believe that we need to get business done in Albany on behalf of the people. And this is a major distraction, unfortunately, particularly as we're at this crucial point in our budget. I think, the concerns of those who have made these charges should be central. And we should be talking about more of their concerns and less of the political and how this, what the ramifications are for the governor.
So I see it from the
women who've made these charges, Michael, should be front and center, and and their complaints need to be front and center of this conversation.
And just to play devil's advocate here, there was some concern when, for example, allegations were made against Al Franken, and he did step down, and then there was maybe some remorse on the part of those who supported his resignation that they didn't wait until more of the investigation had taken place. Why shouldn't we be concerned about doing that on this occasion?
Well, let me just say, I passed a bill up in Albany called the Child Victims Act. It allows the adult survivors of child sexual abuse to file retroactive claims, civil claims against their abusers or the institutions that may have protected them. Over 5,000 people who have been abused as children have come forward. And I can tell you, just understanding their stories, and I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of survivors during the course of the 4-year odyssey to get that bill passed, that it is not easy to come forward. It is not something that you are prone to do as a survivor, particularly when you're speaking out against someone or some institution that has so much trust. And I would include the governor in that category. So my admiration for the survivors is, knows no bounds. And I admire Lindsay for her courage and coming forward. And I think we all need to recognize that. But this is not a criminal inquiry. This is not innocent until proven guilty. So there's a different standard, as well as the fact that character counts. And we have to hold our public officials to the highest standard that we can. And look, we have young people who are looking to the governor, looking to the president of the United States, looking to even our state senators for that type of leadership and exemplary character that I think is something that sadly seems to be in short supply at the uppermost levels of executive office. And once again, we've been disappointed by those who lead. But when you are disappointed, you need a quick course correction. And I think that these type of charges cannot go unanswered. They can't be filed away or delayed by investigations or by, dithering and, calls for slowing down the inquiry or slowing down calls for resignation. We got to fix this, and we got to fix it quickly because we have a budget to pass.
I have to say that one of the big differences I see between Frank and Cuomo is simply the sheer number of complaints that have been made, and also looking specifically at the people who made those complaints. I agree with you, and I'm hopeful that the governor takes.
Yeah, it could be the number, but maybe the right number is one. And again, when we filed the bill for the Child Victims Act, we heard a lot from insurance companies, institutions like the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts of America, that there are going to be false claims. And I'm here to tell you, there has been zero false claims in the Child Victims Act with all the thousands of lawsuits that have been filed. It's just not something that happens. People want to think, I think falsely, that stories are made up and people come forward, and I would say that it is heroic to come forward and tell one's truth, particularly under such difficult circumstances, under the glare of media spotlight, and speaking out against such powerful people. I can't imagine what is required to do that in any of these cases of child sexual abuse or sexual harassment against sexual harassment charges against powerful people.
Let's get into the budget issue, because right now there is important legislation pending right now on the issue of adult use cannabis. I'm sure you know, our law firm represents the state legal cannabis industry, and we have been following the negotiations in Albany over adult use legalization. Right now, seem to be competing bills. There's the governor's bill, and then there's the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, otherwise known as the MRTA. Which proposal do you support, and why?
Well, the MRTA, one, because my colleague and good friend Senator Kruger helped write it, along with Assemblywoman and the Majority Leader Crystal Peoples Stokes. So I think that that's the bill that is the basis of the negotiations now with the Assembly. It's not going to be passed in the budget. We're going to do it outside of the budget, as I think it should be. And I think the governor, with his political capital, a little bit on the ropes, is going to negotiate with us on that. So I think the most important thing about it is that it funnels into the communities that have been most burdened by overzealous enforcement around cannabis, the opportunity for economic and social benefits once the industry is up and running. I think it's very important that those who have endured the most through what we now view as unfair and overzealous prosecution of illegal cannabis share the benefits, and indeed actually get the lion's share of the benefits. The last thing we want is big tobacco coming in and running the show in a state like New York.
Well, in terms of racial and social equity, the governor's bill would still permit marijuana odor as a basis for stop and frisk. It fails to clear prior criminal records of nonviolent marijuana offenders. It fails to protect acts of discrimination against medical marijuana patients in employment, housing, and doesn't allow for home grow. Also something that gets overlooked, it doesn't fix the industrial hemp program to boost local farmers. Would you be willing to compromise on those issues, or are you going to insist that the governor, if there's going to be some sort of compromise, has to come from something outside of social and racial equity?
We've been very stalwart in our insistence that those features of the MRTA remain. And I'm happy to report that they are still in the Assembly negotiation with the Senate. And so we're going to present this to the governor as a bill that has widespread support in both houses. We've got a couple more issues, maybe one issue to reconcile with the Assembly at this stage. And I think we're well on our way to a legislative override because we have the supermajorities in both houses if the governor doesn't go along.
So this is the only time I'm going to ask you to predict anything, because I don't do this on the forum, but in this instance, I feel I must. Will we have adult use cannabis in the state of New York passed this year? Yes. Okay, for those of you who are on, you heard it first. That's good news, not just for the list.
And I will say that the governor is eager to negotiate. So that's a very good sign.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it could have something to do with the news cycle and, a desire by a lot of people to turn the page on this issue, but for a whole host of reasons. But you know what? We'll take what we can get because it is way past time that we have legalized cannabis. And I just want to thank you for your representation in connection with this, because that's going to make the difference.
Well, I appreciate that. And listen, anything we can do to help out the houses of the legislature, we're all in to help you guys with the legislation. Let's turn our attention to housing. In March 2020, the city began using hotels to de-densify our homeless population shelters, particularly from congregate shelters. And what we have found, at least in several of those shelter hotels, is that homeless residents have done far better in these temporary hotels than they have in any other facilities that the city has made available to them. One of those is the Lucerne, which you've supported in court and in the political arena, so thank you for that. Would you use your position as Manhattan Borough President to demand that the city continue to use hotels that are made available by the hotel owners and other temporary facilities like the Lucerne to provide housing to homeless individuals?
Well, I think it's a case-by-case basis, frankly. I mean, it depends on the neighborhood and the structure. I think some of the hotels are better than others. Some of the ones I've seen do not have the rooms for group meetings, for example, or access, for other services. So you got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And we also have the need to build and recreate supportive housing from the ground up. I mean, it can't just be about temporary shelters. We need to get these men and women into supportive housing so they can pursue a life of dignity and feel as if they are members of their community. And I'll tell you this, Michael, in Midtown Manhattan, there's 100 million square feet of empty office space. And that to me is a place where the next borough president should be putting his or her energies into building that supportive and affordable housing. There's support from the Real Estate Board of New York to do that, and other stakeholders. It needs to happen at the local level with community board support, which I always advocate. But I think it's an enormous opportunity to make a difference and connect unhoused New Yorkers to the housing that they need. Shelters are temporary, and while part of the ultimate solution, are just a pathway, I hope, to actual home, rental, and dare I say even home ownership. I mean, we need to provide hope to homeless New Yorkers. We have the worst crisis since the Great Depression. I've stood by unhoused New Yorkers, and I'll continue to do that at every juncture. But the next step is to get them into supportive housing and give them a pathway.
I can tell you at the Lucerne, they started out with 283 homeless residents there. According to the City of New York in their latest filing, that number is now 100. Close to 200 men have been moved to the transition to permanent housing. And I agree with you that the solution to homelessness is not more shelters, but housing. And it's great to hear that you are going to support using some empty space that we have already available to make available to people for hopefully the transition to permanent housing for them. That is, after all, the solution, not just a Band-Aid. Let's talk about the New York Public Library. Quite a few participants in this forum are very concerned about our libraries. About 7 years ago, then public advocate Bill de Blasio urged New Yorkers to support him because he claimed he would prevent the privatization of public assets, which had been a central feature of the Bloomberg administration. Mm-hmm. A prime example of this is the New York Public Library, where the number of hours per week under the de Blasio administration and before COVID went from 80 hours to 56 hours before COVID hit. Saturday hours were eliminated. Sunday hours have been restricted as well. Critics contend that the New York Public Library is now being used for private events, such as weddings and corporate parties for the wealthy. Mm-hmm. And to that end, the New York Public Library, with the support of the de Blasio administration, has submitted an application to the LPC, Landmarks Preservation Commission, to change the configuration of the interior so to create loading bays and catering elevators to assist with the efficiencies of food service. Do you support the reduction of hours and the use of public spaces like the New York Public Library for use for private events?
Generally, no. Unless they're connected to the library's mission. I understand that the budgets that a lot of our nonprofits, have to operate under, and the belts have been tightened considerably. Most nonprofits haven't recovered from the 2009 recession, and I think our support for libraries and other nonprofits has been far below what it should be. I fought the New York Public Library's plan to demolish the stacks, if you remember that, from a few years ago. I was engaged in that, and it was very outspoken. Attended, a lot of demonstrations, wrote letters. I have a great relationship with Peter Marks, the president of the New York Public Library. So I'll be engaged with them in a conversation on this, but, to reduce, space for scholars and visitors and everyday New Yorkers in order to make a buck on the side would not seem to be the way we should utilize precious library space. I think it's what it really is. It's a call to action on the part of government to do more.
So the best way to deal with this is to provide more public funding for libraries, and in terms of adding to the budgets. Right now, we have a real crisis in the city in terms of mega tall or super tall buildings. What do you think about the possibility? And I'm thinking this literally just as you were talking when you talked about budgets. So this is a question that's going to be a little bit cramped. But what do you think about considering a height tax, if you will? In other words, right now we have these residential buildings, these super mega tall buildings. There's one at 432 Park Avenue, for example, which some people refer to as the middle finger to the middle class. Why not consider raising funds for institutions like public institutions like libraries by imposing a height tax or an FAR tax on real estate developers who are making money hand over fist, while public institutions like the library are starved for funds and are, instead of serving the public, they're serving the private?
I'm all for it. That's why I've been fighting for the pied-à-terre tax for several years in Albany that would allow us to tax second and third homes worth $5 million or more, many of those apartments in 432 Park Avenue that you mentioned. I will say that the real estate lobby is highly organized. They're going to fight that tooth and nail, but I've been fighting them on the pied-à-terre tax. I've been fighting them on the rent laws that we passed 2 years ago in Albany that have kept folks in their home. I've been fighting them on the Tenant Safe Harbor Act that prevented tenants from being evicted during the pandemic. So I'm not going to shy away from fights like that. I think a high tax is a novel idea. I'd have to check out the, always there's an issue of some constitutionality, whether at the state or the city level. The pied-à-terre tax, for example, people will say, "Oh, Michael, let's just tax foreigners who have homes." Well, you can't do that. You have to tax people who have non-primary residences, and so that includes a much wider universe. But we should look at that, and we should look at high caps, just like the city of Paris has. The super talls have been taking advantage of our zoning laws through the use of mechanical, bonuses that should be eliminated. They've been taking advantage of the ability to, do the building blocks of FAR. They've been taking advantage of our tax laws, where Ken Griffin, who owns a $300 million plus pied-à-terre, pays a lower effective tax rate than a single family homeowner in Queens. I mean, that's just crazy. And so the answer to questions around great civic institutions like the New York Public Library and how we fund them is to tax those who have the greatest ability to pay. And certainly you need to look at real estate and the global super rich who take advantage of New York's laws and are using this city as a place to protect their investment. There should be a premium on that.
Right. And by the way, you and I are using some inside baseball terms. FAR is a term that deals with the amount of space that you're allowed to exploit within your property and the floor to air ratios. So that's really what that talks about. And when we talk about reducing, we talk about reducing the bulk or the size of buildings. And I'm glad to hear that you are interested in looking at that. For what it's worth, I was a constitutional law professor for 8 years, Brad. I think a height tax would work. And I don't believe it would be confiscatory as long as it wasn't too low. I'm glad to do it. And by the way,
I'll tell you something else, Michael. As borough president, I will not have the privilege of introducing and passing bills that tax real estate. That is Albany's prerogative. That said, you're going to need a borough president who can work with Albany to get that kind of legislation passed. So many roads around taxes and addressing issues like economic inequality and providing for the most vulnerable go through Albany. So I think that's something I bring to the table, is a record of experience being a progressive champion on issues like affordable housing, protecting the most vulnerable, taxing the rich. And that's something I'm going to continue to do as borough president for sure.
Thank you. All right, let's talk now about the McGraw-Hill Art Deco lobby. I mentioned that to you because not only is it something that I know you're interested in, but it's also something that is really right now on the front pages, if you will, of the preservation, the newspapers around New York City. I saw you on Twitter in front of the front door, protesting the possible demolition of the historic Art Deco lobby of the McGraw-Hill building, a demolition which was approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Why do you suppose the commission approved the demolition of this historic interior?
It's a very good question. I think they don't have any guts when it comes to real estate to be, and the economic forces in the city. I think they are have definitely shown um, that their priorities are misplaced. And I also think it's because they got the outside preserved with the sign on top, so they figured that was what they would do on this building. So they'll let this beautiful Art Deco cultural and architectural gem be destroyed. The same thing happened on Park Avenue when the last interior at 234 Park that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright was demolished in the middle of the night. Boy, that made my blood boil, that a developer can get away with that once there is a notion that a interior might be calendared for landmark preservation. What does the developer do? Goes in the dark of night and destroys it and ruins and robs future generations of this beauty. I'm just, just heartsick by it. I hope that the space is still there. I've joined the Art Deco Society in a TRO, just breaking news in the next 24 hours to urge a judge to prevent any further demolition.
Well, I know one of the people behind the effort to preserve the Art Deco lobby is Theodore Grunwald, who's one of the more well-known preservationists in the city.
Yeah.
He submitted an RFE to Landmarks Preservation Commission to designate the interior, with the argument also that the interior is actually an extension of the exterior, since it's sort of almost like a seamless transition. And what happened was it went to the staff at the LPC, the Landmark Preservation Commission, and the staff rejected it without affording the commissioners the opportunity to weigh in on it. And when some of the commissioners found out about this, some of them expressed some real dismay and concern that they were really deprived of the opportunity to speak to an issue of importance to them. What do you think about, and by the way, what happened is apparently consistent with the Landmark Preservation Commission's rules. This is what they do. Shouldn't the commissioners have the opportunity to override a staff recommendation? In other words, even be informed about it in the first instance and then have the opportunity to override it in the same way, for example, that at the Supreme Court, it only takes 4 justices to get a case taken by the Supreme Court. Shouldn't we have a similar system where the commissioners, 4 of them or some number, have the right to say, we want to consider this RFE on a commission basis, not on a staff basis?
That seems completely sensible, but I wish these commissioners would speak out or resign en masse or raise the alarm themselves. I mean, what accounts for their fecklessness while cultural treasures are being destroyed? They're just blaming the staff. That sounds like, a bit of finger pointing. And I've seen that before in bureaucracies, and I don't think the LPC seems to be immune to that.
I would say that if one of the commissioners were on the, and I say one, I'm saying any of the commissioners were here now, they would probably respond by saying, if we resigned in mass, Bill de Blasio would appoint 11 Rebney, toadies to go in there and just destroy the rest of the landmarks. We have to stay around for as long as we can just to preserve what's there. I think that's
a strategy, but look, the alarm bell needs to be rung on this. And I honestly think this hasn't broken through to the general public's concern. As an elected official, I feel like, there's only been a few of us who have spoken out in our local community board, and you got to get traction on this. So you got to do something bold if you're going to, try to save a building or an interior that's threatened with imminent destruction.
I know that the mayor is the party that the individual who has the right to appoint members of the commission, but a Manhattan Borough president could have influence over that process. What would you do to ensure that the people who are appointed to the Landmarks Preservation Commission are going to be dedicated to the preservation of landmarks as opposed to making deals with real estate?
I think you need to step in and for sure, offer your opinion. I don't know, maybe we need letter grades for landmark preservation commissioners, but you got to be outspoken. That's part of the job. You got to be a critic. That's part of the statutory responsibilities of the job, is to hold hearings, to review city services, and of course weigh in on issues like landmarks and other land use actions. So there's a lot that the borough president can do to shape appointments, and certainly asking to meet with all of the LPC nominees and proffer your assessment of them would be something I'd consider.
Hmm. And the last chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, when she resigned, she went to work for the law firm that was representing Mayor de Blasio. And that law firm is one of the most successful real estate lobbying law firms in the city. Now a former chair of the commission is working for a real estate lobbying firm with business before the Landmarks Preservation Commission. How much time do you think a commissioner or a chairperson of the Landmarks Preservation Commission should be required to wait before going into private business in an industry that has business before the very commission that he or she was either in charge of or a participant of?
Well, I've always thought lifetime bans on lobbying from former public officials is a good idea. I don't know what the appropriate time frame is short of that. I will say that I don't think everyone is, as nefarious as it might seem in terms of joining various law firms and representing different interests. But I think you need to hold the public officers accountable through through high standards of office holding while they are in the position, and perhaps consider something as extensive as longer term bans or lifetime bans if there's ever any evidence of some sort of collusion. You certainly shouldn't be entering public service for that reason, and it is disappointing to hear that members of the LPC who are charged with the protection of our city's landmarks are now engaged in trying to dismantle them.
Right. Well, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the former chair is engaged in anything nefarious, just so that the record is clear on that. But it does create.
No, I'm only saying that connection between former elected officials and representing private interests. Sometimes to the public seems like a straight line. It isn't always. I and I know you're not suggesting that, but I'm only saying that we need to protect those former public officials, right? They need to have guardrails in place. And that's why lifetime bans on lobbying is something we might consider. We certainly, and short of that, I don't know how many years, but you don't want to make it a worthwhile endeavor for somebody to jump to the other side and to try to use their public office at any point. And again, we're not suggesting anyone is, but why create the temptation by having such weak regulatory framework around former public officials?
Fair enough. One last question on preservation before we turn to environmental issue. Right now, the Landmarks Preservation Commission's jurisdiction is focused on properties or scenic areas that have been designated, or historic districts that have been designated. But every once in a while, a building is proposed adjacent to an historic landmark. And the building is outside the district or is not designated, but the landmark is. One example of this is the Grand Central Terminal right now, which we all know is a designated landmark, has an adjacency. The Hyatt Hotel is there, it used to be the Commodore. And they're now proposing, I think, a 1,600-foot tall tower next door. And the Landmark Preservation Commission's perspective is we don't have jurisdiction over that other building. We can make a report and recommendation, but we cannot actually make a determination as to whether it's appropriate. A similar situation involves the Merchant's House, with which I'm sure you are very familiar. The Merchant's House is outside the historic district in which this other building is in. And so the question has become, can Landmarks Preservation Commission simply deny an application because of the impact it's going to have on a landmark, even though that landmark is not the building that is the subject of the application. So my question for you is, do you agree that if it doesn't exist now, it should, that the Landmarks Preservation Commission should have the power to determine whether or not an adjacent property may have an adverse impact on an historic building?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've seen it in the Merchant House. You know, the foundation of the building is in jeopardy. The whole, wall could collapse. I would think that's not too dissimilar from the old Commodore Hotel in Grand Central Station. The proximity to a landmark needs to be respected, and the LPC should have jurisdiction over that 100%.
So if we need legislation to amend the landmarks law to make sure that the LPC, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, knows it has that jurisdiction, you'd support it?
Of course, and I think it's a really good idea. I want to broaden the designation of landmarks too. I don't think it should just be aesthetics and architectural significance. We need to dig down deep into cultural landmarks. That's one of the reasons why the Poe House, which I mentioned at this head of this program, was demolished, is that the building itself didn't hold any architectural significance according to the LPC at the time. But certainly what happened in that building was magical and should be revered by New Yorkers.
Well, I'll tell you, and I'll remind you that one of the things that you worked on that was a project I was involved in was 827, 831 Broadway, which involved one of the first loft artist in residence buildings in the Greenwich Village area that Willem de Kooning and Paul Jenkins first had their studios in, and you were instrumental in helping establish that as an historic landmark based upon its cultural significance. So you're right.
Sometimes we win that, but the law, I think you would agree, needs to be clarified and strengthened.
I agree with you, and I'm glad to work with you on that if you end up becoming our borough president. Let's now talk about Local Law 97. I got a question about this one, which I found very interesting. Local Law 97, for those people who don't know, is an effort to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, beginning with the implementation of carbon emission caps beginning by 2024, just 3 years from now. And while that's a laudable goal, some residential co-ops and condos have expressed concerns that the benchmarks and the timing fail to take into consideration the costs associated with achieving timely compliance. Would you support conducting a feasibility study in New York City to ascertain how the city, through subsidies, grants, and tax breaks, maybe could support some of those buildings in their efforts to achieve compliance with a very important policy objective of reducing carbon emissions?
Yes, and I'll also tell you, Michael, that the governor's budget proposed overriding Local Law 97 altogether, and we've fought back on that, and it is not included in the Senate one house, nor the Assembly, to my knowledge. So we're going to be taking the executive on that issue on a broader level.
Great. We have a few minutes left. I want to talk to you about Broadway.
Sure.
I love Broadway. I love going to shows, and it's really been just terrible that I haven't been able to go to the theater in now over 12 months. Broadway has been decimated, not just the theaters themselves, but also performers and the associated businesses that operate in proximity to Broadway, all being crushed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Would you support a PPP or Small Business Administration-like program to help bring back Broadway so that it can come back stronger than it was before?
Absolutely. And we've got some of that in this year's budget. We're working on direct grants to arts organization by funneling some of the federal money, up to $500 million that we've identified that could be used toward arts and cultural institutions like Broadway theaters and like independent venues. I'm also working on trying to expand the music and theatrical production tax credit. I want to give a leg up to small businesses by removing the onerous commercial rent tax, which only applies south of 96th Street and is essentially a double tax for all those businesses all the way down to Lower Manhattan. And I have legislation to assist commercial tenants through a bill that I've sponsored called the Save Our Storefronts Act, which would also provide state relief. The arts and cultural institutions that represent New York are one of the reasons why so many young people move here, and the creative economy has to be central in our rebuilding. We can't take it for granted that it's going to be here after the pandemic. We've seen up to 1/3 to 1/2 of small businesses shutter, and Broadway is no different. I live next to a musician, and he and his colleagues have been out of work. I'm happy to see that the Met has, relinquished, some of their earlier position on providing aid to those struggling artists during the pandemic over the last day or so. But there's so many other, including stagehands, who've been locked out of the Metropolitan Opera. So we need to make sure that if we do give federal and state aid to these Broadway theaters and places like the Metropolitan Opera, that the money goes to the workforce. And that's what I'm going to be following very closely. The Save Our Storefronts bill that Senator Schumer passed is an important step, but unless workers really get the benefit of it, it'll just be lost, to those who need it most.
So when it comes to the Broadway and the arts, how much money right now are you proposing to provide in terms of funding to theaters and performers and people in that situation?
We have $500 million at the moment, plus commercial rent relief. That is a couple of $100 million, plus other assistance for unemployed New Yorkers, which is well over $100 million. So all in total, it's a $500 million or more. But I think that's probably scratching the surface, which is why we need to be focused on raising new revenue. Our Senate One House does that, but frankly, I think we can go deeper in terms of personal income taxes and mostly corporate franchise taxes. But we're in a negotiation now with the Assembly. But the bottom line is, the federal money, there's going to be a one-shot. We need to build revenue out, Michael, for future years of difficulty in arts and cultural institutions. And one of my ideas is to ensure that those institutions, nonprofit institutions that do so well, say the Museum of Modern Art, that they pay toward supporting arts and cultural institutions that may not be doing so well, particularly those in places like northern Manhattan or in Chinatown, local community nonprofits that have been hit most hard by the pandemic and don't have those titans of industry on their boards of directors.
So here's something that, as you speak about these issues, comes to my mind, and I bet you the people listening are going to have the same thought in their minds. They're thinking to themselves, this guy's got some great, amazing legislation that's going to really have a great impact. What happens if he becomes borough president? Who's going to carry the mantle for you in the state Senate? Do you have someone who is going to carry these these bills to fruition in the event that you are to be successful as a Manhattan Borough president, and someone else has to carry the ball for you?
Well, let's not forget that Gail Brewer, our current borough president, one of her biggest claims to fame was a bill that provided sick leave for workers. So I think the best measure of how someone's going to do as borough president is by their record. And, rather than just having a bunch of ideas, I've got a legislative record of over 100 bills and bills that I'm working on now, which I hope to pass this session. So, don't stress. I'm going to get these bills passed one way or the other before I leave the office. But I hope that your viewers and other New Yorkers will look at the totality of my record, passing progressive bills on affordable housing, on protecting children, on making sure that our mass transit runs, on protecting arts and cultural institutions and local control, as well as my ideas for the office, making certain that every community board has the opportunity to initiate a 197 local rezoning, having a housing economist on the board of the borough president, so we can see whether that plan, say the Commodore Hotel redevelop, actually gives the value to the taxpayers and New Yorkers that the city and the state would claim it does, and rooting out corruption in our local community boards. It's hard to believe, Michael, but lobbyists actually are permitted to serve on community boards, as well as the staff of elected officials. We need to continue to reform community boards and make sure that they're reflective of the diversity of Manhattan. We have far too many board members who don't represent the diversity of our neighborhoods, and that's a problem that I aim to fix too.
Excellent. All right. Well, listen, we've run through our questions. I have this speed round. First of all, thank you very much. You really got into the details of policy, which is exactly what this forum is supposed to be about. You've really provided a lot of information to people who've been watching. And this will be available, by the way, on YouTube as well. So we'll be able to get this out there. I think it's great that you're talking about the issues in a really detailed way. But now let's get to the fun stuff. Are you ready for the speed round?
Sure.
Okay, here we go. Knicks or Nets?
Knicks.
It sounded like you said both. We'll let you get away with that. All right, here's the next one. If there were one person whose leadership style you'd like to adopt as your own, whose would it be?
I really, Gail Brewer for starters, because she's the closest to the office. But, we've got a number of borough presidents who have done an amazing job. I want to build on their successes.
Excellent. Beatles or Rolling Stones?
Oh, the Beatles for sure. Thank you for asking that.
Your favorite movie comedy?
My favorite movie comedy is probably, the most recent Borat film. I mean, how could you go wrong with that?
Your favorite season?
Spring, and I'm looking forward to it. Has it here yet? Are we still waiting?
We have another 6 days? What's today? The 18th? Oh, it's 3 days. So, whatever it is. I don't even know what today's date is. That's what happens with COVID. Yeah, 3 more days. Okay. Water skiing.
Knicks. I'm pretty sure I said Knicks.
You said, I'm sorry?
I'm pretty sure I said Knicks.
Oh, you did say Knicks.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you said net.
Yeah, maybe I was speaking Russian there briefly.
Okay, I'm a Knicks fan too, although
yeah,
the Nets
gotta be the Knicks
lately. Let's see, water skiing, downhill skiing, or cross country skiing?
I've never skied in my life. That's probably partially due to my background being raised in rural West Virginia, although I should have learned to ski given that we had mountains around us, but no skiing.
Okay, well then I'll ask a question that I know you'll have an answer to one way or the other. Your favorite at-home family activity?
I would say playing backgammon with my 10-year-old. She's got a fierce game.
Wow, I didn't realize your daughter was 10 years old already.
Yeah, I have a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old, my husband and I.
Oh.
And it's or reading to my 3-year-old who's just now learning the pleasures of words and books, and it's something my mother impressed on me that my husband and I are trying to share.
Very nice, very nice. If you had to give up ice cream or pizza, which would it be? And you've got to pick one. You can't say.
I can't say ice pizza. Ice cream or pizza? I definitely give up ice cream. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Love pizza.
Which recording artist from your iPhone or however you keep your music would we be most surprised to find out is on your list?
Who would you be most surprised? You wouldn't be surprised to know a gay guy who grew up in the 80s that I have a lot of Madonna on my phone, I'll tell you that. Billie Eilish?
Billie Eilish.
Yeah.
Did you see the recent Grammys, by the way?
Sure. That was amazing.
It was amazing. There was one particular number that I thought was very interesting. Uh, my wife is laughing in the background because we had to turn it off for a few minutes. I was pretty shocked, but it was musically very entertaining for sure.
Yeah, it was a good show. I love the line that Trevor Noah said. The only person who wishes it was still 2020 is Governor Cuomo. Oh,
Okay. First of all, great answers in the speed round. Thank you very much. I have a question in the chat. I know I anticipated quite a few questions because in advance of the of today's forum, I invited people to send me their questions, and actually I asked several of them. So the first one that comes up is from Nadine Friedman, and I'll read it to you and to everyone else. I'm interested in how Brad will address racial and economic inequality that arose during the pandemic. Rich white New Yorkers getting vaccines, testing, resources faster and easier than poor persons of color. I can't see I don't know what BI stands for. I'm sorry. But persons of color
yeah.
in other boroughs. Is there a philosophy or plan on how he might work with other leaders on these issues?
I would say overall data collection, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And I believe, Michael, that the borough president, again, a charter mandated responsibility of overseeing city services has to begin with understanding what data is out there. Gail Brewer's done a great job in that regard through Beta NYC. I want to take it another step further and create something that I'm calling Borough Stat. You have CompuStat, you have Police Stat, which is a bill I passed in Albany. Borough Stat would be a dashboard for New Yorkers to see in real time and understand how issues like vaccine distribution and other inequalities, other city services might be lagging, such as trash collection in your neighborhood, or the provision for unhoused New Yorkers. How that looks in a dashboard that New Yorkers could use. Let's actually kind of peel back the layer of 311 and see how it's working. I think that's a great role for the next borough president.
I think income inequality has become, as awful as it has been over the decades, it's become especially notable and especially problematic right now. As long as we're talking about that, what other measures can you foresee the borough president's position making use of to ensure that income inequality is better addressed, not only here in the city, but also addressed in Albany?
Well, I think the next borough president needs to be a champion for legislation at every level of government that addresses this. Certainly the New York Health Act in Albany should be supported by the next borough president. We need a single payer system so that every New Yorker has access to a healthcare system that provides for them and their children. And we don't have that. We have, millions of New Yorkers who are not insured and have no recourse. And we have to fix that. We have to continue to support our public hospitals, which is something I've been a champion of. I had Bellevue in my Senate district, and the next borough president should be certainly on that campaign. And then finally, we need to make certain that city agencies that are given the mission to protect the most vulnerable, like DHS, actually are doing their job. And if they're not doing their job, we need to have hearings, and the borough president has the ability to hold hearings and call out city agencies that are, looking past those who need the most help.
Excellent. I've gotten two more questions, and they're both related. The first question, and by the way, they're not in the chat, but people text me as of these things going on. So one of the questions I got, and it's about real estate. Are you accepting political donations and contributions from real estate developers?
No, and it's nothing, it's not that I think real estate developers are inherently bad people. It's just that they are a highly regulated industry, and the borough president provides that oversight, so I don't think it's appropriate.
Fair enough. And so this is a related question. You mentioned REBNY, which we didn't define for people who may not know. That's the Real Estate Board of New York, which is essentially the lobbying organization for the real estate industry here. So I assume the answer is the same. Are you accepting any contributions from REBNY or any association?
No, same answer. Again, I'm not casting aspersions either. It's just that as borough president in his or her land use role, it wouldn't seem to be inspiring public confidence to do so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And that is important, as we were talking about earlier, with people who have served on boards and then end up in front of those boards. It may not be something nefarious, but it gives a perception. It creates a perception. Right. Brad, this has been a really informative discussion. I thank you so much for being a part of it. And I look forward to continuing our public dialogue on these issues and on others as time goes on. For those who are watching, next week we have Lindsay Boylan, and the week after that we have Maya Wiley, who is a candidate for mayor of the city of New York. Lindsay Boylan is candidate for Manhattan Borough President against Brad Hoylman and others. Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward. Hopefully, you'll come back to us when you go onto your next gig, whatever it might be. Thanks again, Brad.
Thank you. I definitely said Knicks.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.